Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm just going to admit a last couple of people here. And I'm going to remind you to, for most of you, it's possible to activate your cameras, and let's turn off our mics for the talk. And then at the end, we'll get some questions going, some conversation going. And if with a slight change, if you want to write your questions in the chat window, and I'll keep my eye out for them, and then I'll go through some of those questions and try to get to things that I can ask for you. So let's get started. This is our UB Visiting Artist Speaker Series. Hold on, a couple more people to come in. Okay, well, tonight I'm pleased to welcome Stephanie Syjuco today. One more, who you see on screen. Born in the Philippines and currently professor of art at UC Berkeley, Syjuco's work addresses political concerns regarding issues of labor and economies within the capitalist system. Through large-scale spectacles of collected cultural objects, cumulative archives, and temporary participatory installations, Syjuco's projects leverage open source systems, shareware logic, and flows of capital in order to investigate issues of economies and power. A deep researcher and a committed maker, Syjuco makes research-driven projects that evolve into intensively crafted outcomes, exploring constructs of identity and cultural authenticity. Syjuco's explaining her approach to a social practice defines it as one that centers on relational negotiation, public participation, or group activation in order for the work to exist. One of Syjuco's performative projects, this one for the Frieze Art Fair, I think about 4 years ago, entailed creating what she describes as a counterfeiting site in which she and additional art workers made bootleg replicas of nearby high-end artworks for sale at the fair, and made knockoffs available for sale at so-called bargain prices. This work, a durational 5-day performance in the form of an art pirating workshop, though comical, presented its audience with a serious critique of commodity and value making in the rarefied context of blue chip art and commerce. Another project, Not MoMA, took the form of a re-presentation of art historical works to be made available to a population that might not typically have access to them. Syjuco's worked with students to fabricate remakes of iconic works of art and design as an accessible proxy museum. In another recent project, Debt Worth, a visual display of accumulated debt, Syjuco's installation consisted of color prints representing stacks of money. Participants of this piece are invited to cut out, fold, glue together stacks of money representations, creating physical proxies of their debt and adding to a collective pile. Syjuco's projects activate new layers of interpretation by incorporating materials and images into systems through which they move and engage the world. There is a productive interrogation of established cultural constructs that happens when her materials circulate and facilitate a dialogue with audience. Stephanie Syjuco has worked as an artist and educator for many years. At UC Berkeley, she is currently working to expand a conceptual and materials-based pedagogy, combining methods of the handcrafted with digital technologies and social engagement. Syjuco is a recipient of Guggenheim Fellowship Award, a Joan Mitchell Award. Her work has been shown internationally, including in exhibitions at the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Smithsonian, SF MoMA, ZKM Center for Art and Technology in Germany, and many, many, many more. Now we welcome Stephanie Syjuco to UB. Stephanie, thank you for joining us.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much, Max. It's really nice to be here. Also, thank you to Baron for the initial invitation and reaching out to me. So first of all, I just want to say how amazing it is to see all your faces. As was mentioned, I'm a professor and my students are not this present anymore, which is wonderful. So somehow no one's cameras seem to work anymore, but it's really, really nice to see everyone. So, okay. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to start screen sharing, and as Max mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A session afterwards. So, hold on off on the questions, and then we'll get them to the chat. Let me share. Okay. All right. So I'm also going to keep time, and that's just to be kind to everybody. Today, I've chosen to show about 8 projects. And the reason I chose these is actually based on a really, I think, condensed time period. So, at the, I'm choosing about 4 years worth of work, which is pretty fascinating considering that we're 4 years after a very pivotal moment. And, within that 4 years, it actually made me reconsider a lot of why I was making artwork and what the work was about. So it's interesting to read what Max's introduction was about, because honestly, much of the work that I'm going to show today is not necessarily related to the descriptions of capitalism, but more about issues of American history and how I consider either my place in American history or others' representations in history. So today I titled the talk, Insert, Duplicate, Delete, on the politics of imaging and representation. And so I choose this title actually quite specifically because most recently I've become known for working on photography or photo-based works. But I actually really resist the definition of being a photographer. I'm more interested in how images are created, how they're manufactured, and also how they flow through different systems. So that's different from the kind of authorship that I think, the traditional definition of a photographer, what they do. So again, just to kind of think about previous works, I've been a professional artist for almost 25 years now. So I count that from literally my undergraduate graduation in 1995 up until the present. And I went to school for sculpture at the San Francisco Art Institute. And most of my training was really in the production and construction of objects, of sometimes, hundreds or thousands of things. And in many cases, these things would be produced in collaboration or with the participation of the public or other collaborators. So what we're seeing is a kind of, broad overview of these installations that were also hosted by, in some cases, large galleries or nonprofits or museums. And a lot of these projects were also, they were temporary. There was a moment in which the public was invited to come in and sometimes, buy things or, or create something or kind of, have time together in the spaces. So, it is also related to kind of social practice projects that I work on, but they also, every project looks pretty different. So, as some background, I also just wanted to kind of talk about this constellation of works that I do. And it's interesting to notice that sculpture is in the middle of it, because in the end, despite this very sort of different array of things that I produce, I do think it all revolves almost like satellites around this central theme. And so whether I'm working on issues of, say, social practice or public pedagogy, print and publications, databases, textiles and craft, and then, photography, installation, and video, or even digital 3D scanning and media, for me, they still are really rooted in stuff in some way. And then I also like to think about how my work operates. So, the traditional notion of an artist as being, just someone who's in their studio and then they work, to create products that go into galleries or even museums. I actually like to think about it, quite larger. So this is my sort of rough, Venn diagram sketch of showing where the dots, which are kind of like the projects that I work on, how I think they operate in different spheres. So whether that's literally the art world or, the larger public, which includes also, citizenship, public life, a greater community, and then the academy, which, we're finding ourselves in right now, which is like the school or the institution, this sort of formal space of learning and sharing. And as some background as well into, the projects I'm going to be sharing, this is not my artwork, but this I think is a really nice visual description of how I think about my practice right now, which is looking at the the construction of images and how we also value those images. So what we're seeing is actually the kind of apparatus, the studio setup of a traditional kind of photography space. And it's interesting that it's not, what we're looking at here isn't necessarily the subject of what's being photographed, but actually all the accessories to make the image as perfect as possible. And there's a lot of work that goes into the construction of images. If we think about the notion of, say, what is it, like fake news or fabricated events or fabricated images, there's a lot of production value around these things, which shows that the stories that we see in the world are not necessarily natural, nor are they nor are they neutral. And so along with, Chroma Key green, which is a very standard, backdrop color, it's how you use it in digital post-production. You shoot something against it, and then you're able to substitute the green background for almost anything. It's really kind of like an empty placeholder. There's also, for me, this fascinating look at other forms of very visible things that are supposed to be invisible. So for those that are familiar with digital image editing through Photoshop, the very last layer in Photoshop is this really interesting gray and white checkerboard pattern, which is interesting because you're not supposed to see it. It's a sign that there's nothing behind it, and yet it's so highly visible. To me, it operates similarly to the vibrancy of the Chroma Key green screen. They're both very much there, but you're not supposed to see them. And so this type of kind of visual editing and the transference of digital images back into physical space really popped up around 2017. And this is literally immediately after the presidential election in 2016, which for many people was a surprise. And then the stories that came up afterwards as to who was fighting against who or who was on what side became for me really fascinating in terms of seeing how they were constructed. So, in 2016, I was working mostly on, I think, a large array of projects dealing with both capitalism and globalization and all these, to me, like very important themes. But after the election, I really started to think harder about what it meant to be a quote unquote American, like what it meant to, really exist in this country, and also how I've had to negotiate my space here, as well as other people's spaces within the country. So, what we're looking at right now is an exhibition in New York that consists of photographs as well as handcrafted displays. And what appears to be on the right-hand side, these signs that I was actually, I was downloading protest banners from the internet and then cutting out the shapes based on how the picture itself had the banner droop, and then constructing it from scratch using fabric. So, a detail of it shows, you can kind of see the distortion of the text, and that was literally based on how the sign was being held in, a real protest. And so if you have two people holding a sign and it kind of droops in the middle, you get a kind of illegible quality of the text. And then you can also see at the bottom what looked like, the cutouts that were left by people's heads under the sign. And so essentially these three banners are literally the same sign. I was attending a lot of protests in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, specifically at UC Berkeley, because in 2017, there was a massive influx of white nationalists who came to the college campus to take advantage of the notion of free speech. And it was this incredibly polarizing event, which really also kind of forced students and forced a lot of people to kind of figure out how they would start positioning themselves in relationship to these extreme ideas. And one of this banner, which literally says "become ungovernable," started popping up in many of the protests. And so it was a recurring slogan, but based on the news coverage that I started to see, in which it would position people as being, say, violent if they, were protesting the white nationalists, it became really clear to me that, you know, the narratives were being highly fabricated. And if anything, the text and the slogans that people were attempting to share were starting to become illegible. You know, they weren't, nobody was really listening. And I started realizing too that the slogan itself, to become ungovernable, you know, if your own government starts to turn into an entity in which you cannot follow it, what does it mean to become ungovernable? And fascinatingly, these banners too, with the text starting to be illegible, it was as if this possibility opened up as to, you know, transforming into something else. This is a detail, and you can kind of see, since they're hand fabricated, you know, I stitched these, I hand sewed them, and I also left threads to dangle down as if, you know, the work itself was kind of unfinished or unruly. And then they were held up with, you know, these steel armatures in place of people. So, you know, similar to like a stage set or some form of, you know, there was a reverse side to the front, as if it was a kind of theater. And then alongside the installation were portraits. They were photographs of that I was titling overall under the main title Citizen. And this is Portrait of P. And they're fabricated portraits of individuals that I was seeing at the protests, but so these are anti-fascist protesters who traditionally dress in black to cover themselves. And these are not the real protesters because, you know, there's an anonymity to anti-fascists or the anti-fascist protesters, and there's a tactic to remaining anonymous. So what I did was I worked with UC Berkeley students who attended the protests with me, or, you know, at the same time, and we remade, based on the types of people we were seeing, we restaged them using the students themselves as the models. And so in a way, it was a kind of collaborative remembering of creating portraits of people who are really unphotographable, because, you know, to be exposed is to also make yourself known and potentially doxxed by right-wing extremists. And doxing is a kind of form of like public display of your personal information. So portrait of R. And it was interesting working with these young undergraduate students because, you know, through the kind of modeling of posing for this, we also talked about, we worked together to kind of discuss how they felt their potential role was moving forward, you know, as resistors to, you know, to a new government administration, which literally was attacking them. So all the young students I worked with were of color, queer, trans, undocumented, and folks that were literally finding themselves in the crosshairs of the new politics. So Citizen, Portrait of S, Citizen, Portrait of B. And alongside the installation was a giant backdrop that I hand fabricated. So the portraits, the protest banners, and then this giant hand sewn, what looks like kind of a quilt, but is actually a, well, I guess it's a quilt. It's a tiny, it's 26 feet long by 12 feet high, and it consists of entirely sewn 2-inch by 2-inch squares that is very similar, or, you know, it's a reference to the total transparency backdrop in Photoshop. And it kind of, you know, tapers off at the bottom, almost like as a digital form. And I wanted to hand make these because I also wanted to share, or to show that, you know, the construction of digital images, even if it's done through a computer, is itself a very physical act. You know, there's intent behind how one decides to position someone in an image, or how one captions or crops an event. And, you know, by hand fabricating it, this is the reverse, which I also, you can kind of peek behind it in the installation and see it, and you can see all the seams and, you know, the kind of roughness of the fabric. And by pairing this kind of extreme, you know, the digital reference with the extreme textile and craft quality of it was also for me a way to kind of bridge, you know, the different forms of making and different forms of commentary. So alongside with that installation also, I wanted to, I created another project that was based on the history of the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. So, in thinking about the reality of 2017 and some of the rhetoric coming out about who belongs in the country and who doesn't, despite citizenship or family, it points directly back to actual historical events. So, in World War II, the Japanese American communities throughout the United States were forcibly removed, over 120,000, and put into concentration camps. And the notion that that can't ever happen again, I think, was really, it's tenuous, right? It's like we've sort of decided that we can actually handle other people, being incarcerated in many different ways. And so if we look back and think about how extreme, some of these things have been, we're still there in many ways. We've just sort of segmented it out to other different types of people. So that, taking some of these images and signs, this is a photo by Dorothea Lange, which I pulled inspiration from. This is literally from Oakland, California. I live in Oakland. This is a storefront run by a Japanese American who, after Pearl Harbor, commissioned this sign to be placed outside of his store in order to literally declare, I'm an American, like I'm not the enemy. Unfortunately, this kind of campaign didn't work. He wound up having to sell the store and was relocated and lost his livelihood in the Bay Area. But thinking about this sign and what it means today, I created a version of it in which I literally took the slogan and the font and I inverted it. I used white text on a black fabric panel and spelled out, I'm an American. And this works as it's a room divider in a gallery. So what it does is it's on a track on the ceiling that it bifurcates the room at an angle. And the last part of it, which is the word American, is constricted in a way that is almost illegible. And what I was thinking about with this project is both a mix of, what does it mean to retract someone's rights as an American? Like, what does it mean to compress it, to remove it, to repeal it almost, to draw it back? And this, technically the word is still there and it can be opened, but it seems much more appropriate to have it compressed at this point. It's also shown in conjunction with a photo, and you can see that on the back right. And this photograph, it's called Total Transparency Filter, Portrait of N. And it's a formal portrait sitting of an individual who is undocumented. And I was literally trying to figure out, how do I create a portrait of a very specific person who actually cannot be photographed as well, for personal reasons of, potentially now being in danger. And it's really amazing how, as a DACA recipient, as a student actually at UC Berkeley, who had been able to pursue her dream to go to college and grow up in the US, all of a sudden a policy changed it so quickly that now she was in fear for potentially being deported and essentially having a promise rescinded. And so for this portrait, we decided we worked together on it and decided to cover her with a digitally printed sheer fabric in the pattern of the Photoshop transparency filter. And what it references really is this notion of her potential removal, but also a kind of potential of her being hidden for her own safety, right? Like it operates both ways. And it's been a really bittersweet kind of project because I have a very close relationship to her, and watching her navigate the last 4 years has been, incredibly difficult. And alongside the work too is our two photographs that also employ the Chroma Key green. And on closer inspection, the pair of photographs, it's called Chroma Key Aftermath, and there are two of them. They are complete reconstructions of scenes of protest scenes. So as I was attending a lot of these protests, usually after the fact, you would see a lot of stuff littering the ground. And so whether they were ad hoc or impromptu weapons or barriers or sticks or bricks or rocks, there was a lot of street fighting. And this is the kind of stuff too that may or may not have actually gone into the news during the time, but to witness it and to kind of, to be there as this was happening felt really surreal. And so by recreating these in a studio setup and making everything chroma key green. So this is using literally the chroma key green backdrop fabric, as well as a digitally matched chroma key paint. These aren't photoshopped at all. These are literally, fabricated and then set up. The idea being was that, the story of what was happening during these protests was highly manipulated by the media. It was almost impossible to kind of really share what was happening because of the spin that was put on top of it. So, that was an interesting bookend because, making work that was in a direct response to, a very immediate event, like literally, the election happened and that happened, and then the inauguration in January, and then I had a show that September. And so I spent the next 9 months completely changing what I thought I was going to do to create, that project. It also made me realize that I wanted to dig further into this notion of American history. And I think that's partly because we have not really reckoned with so much of it. This is a photograph from a historical reenactment. It's probably the Battle of Gettysburg during the U.S. Civil War. And there's this interesting way that Americans like to keep reliving these things, as if the South never lost. And we see that, in so much in our contemporary culture, but this kind of play acting, is actually quite serious, right? Like we could choose to do so many things, and yet this holds the public imagination so strongly. I never actually noticed it before, but right in the center is a guy wearing a gray and white checkerboard scarf. That's hilarious. And so I was also thinking about, I guess, also with reenactments, there's a lot of costumes that are available to construct, and whether these are for theatrical plays on U.S. history, or cosplay maybe, or even Halloween. A lot of these costumes throughout American history are these like condensed versions of reality. There's nothing necessarily authentic with these types of commercial patterns. They're like an idea of a pilgrim, or an idea of a revolutionary garment, or the idea of, say, a Southern belle. And what I also wanted to do was completely work on the notion of this type of fabrication of American history and the narratives that come with it, and do it using the Chroma Key green screen fabric. So this was an exhibition at the Smithsonian Renwick Gallery, which is a craft gallery situated actually directly across from the White House, which I really appreciated. So I spent almost a year working on sewing and making these dresses. And I decided to choose 3 dresses from 3 different time periods. So on the left is the kind of like a Plymouth Pilgrim, which sort of represents the narrative of the founding of the country. On the right is the 1776, colonial revolution era garment. And in the middle is the Southern Belle Civil War antebellum South garment. And by constructing them completely out of the Chroma Key green screen, it was also a way for me to talk about how the historical stories are completely fabricated and narrated on top of reality. Like, you could project so much onto these, and they do have, as an immigrant. So, I came to the country when I was 3 from the Philippines, and it took me until I was 26 years old to become a US citizen. But I am American and culturally, as well as having gone through, the American educational system. And so the stories that I grew up with, or I was told, are, in complete contrast to the reality, whether that was, the removal of indigenous folks, with the expansion of the US, or, the actual, anxieties and traumas of slavery. Like, these things are somehow, narrated in nice ways. And also, by using the dress as a form, and the kind of fanciness of it, was also a way to talk about how completely overworked this narrative is. Oops. So what I wanted to point out, I'm going to go back a moment. So through this method, I handcrafted everything. I learned 19th century ribbon embroidery techniques. I handmade the bonnet from scratch using millinery techniques. I hand crocheted the lace. And this is all through extensive material research. The green fabric of the dresses is actually backdrop fabric. It's literally the cotton photography backdrop. And then I had to sort of like find all the matching, chroma key color objects. And the other reason I wanted to, really hand fabricate and do it myself was I also wanted to implicate myself as an American and as an Asian immigrant American. I also think that, the legacies and histories of the United States are not something that I get to sort of say that I'm not a part of just because I came to the country in the 1970s. Like, I benefit from and also am implicated in the racist policies of the United States. And so I want to claim this history and also claim the responsibility for re-envisioning it and re-narrating it. So, again, by handcrafting it, I wanted to put my body and my hands through the motions of reconstructing America. And this is the Plymouth Pilgrim, more simplified and actually, quite a very straightforward costume. The Colonial Revolution. And so on the heels of that, in 2018, I was invited to be in an exhibition in Moscow. And so that included, traveling to Moscow and proposing a project for it. What I wound up making was a project called Rogue States, which is literally a selection of 24 flags that hang high up on the ceiling in a room, and you're able to walk underneath it. And it sort of appears at first like almost like a United Nations style collection of countries. And then on closer inspection, you can kind of see like, well, some things look like they could be, South American or maybe African or Middle Eastern. There's all these symbols and suggestions for potential nationalities. But what it actually is a collection of flags of what are considered enemy states in popular Hollywood and European films. So these are fake countries that were literally made up in order to provide a fictional enemy for the Western protagonist. So if you look through, some of the descriptions here of the movies, it's everything from, James Bond, Casino Royale, to Die Hard 2, to Indiana Jones, to Ace Ventura, a mix of like comedy and action, and essentially gathering together this collection of others, of enemies that have literally been made up to prove a point of America's kind of central, narrative of itself as being the savior. I think let me go back. I think what's also kind of funny about it too is that, when you look at this collection, it's actually kind of endless. I found, way more flags than this from online searches, but also the title Rogue States, is the rogue quality actually, these countries, these other countries, or is it the United States, which is the rogue state? Especially if you look at the time period, from, the last presidency. And then following that, in 2018, I did a project commissioned through the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art called Added Value. And this was, I love actually working with SF MoMA. I think this was the third project that they'd commissioned me to do. Usually when I work with them, we create a kind of very participatory project. So it's temporary. This was a 5-day, 1,500 square foot installation, which functioned as a radical reorganization of knowledge using low value used books for sale to the general public. So essentially, I opened up a used bookstore in the lobby of SF MoMA. I'll explain a little bit more because it was an unexpected bookstore, but I also invited 2 other artist collaboratives to work with me. And the whole thing was a benefit for the San Francisco Public Library's education department. It was essentially a fundraiser. But So you wander into this bookstore space and you start to kind of see these sections, which are quite different from what you would find in a quote unquote normal bookstore. Because the logic of the store was that we were taking existing bodies of knowledge and reorganizing them in a way to prioritize a more, I would say, marginal or not necessarily the highest priority in terms of, power structures. So instead of, say, economics, we called it wealth and accumulation. We had a section called revolutions, which was also able to kind of pull all sorts of different revolutions from different time periods, different definitions of what a revolution could be. You might be able to see, we had a whole section on empire and collapse. And so if you think about new ways to reorganize existing books, this challenge to the kind of hierarchical structure that we all grew up with and all are kind of used to, when we think about how that orders how we see ourselves even in those structures, this was a fun and playful, let me go back. It was a fun and playful way to also present, different ideas to the public. So because of my collaborators, we all had different kind of categories that we came up with. This was done by the collaborative related tactics. And so they were really interested in issues of whiteness. And so, one subsection was how we learn to see ourselves through the lens of whiteness when your culture becomes a trend, and then white women discovering themselves amongst the other. And again, this is, if you come from a background in which these topics resonate with you and you walk into a bookstore, it's incredibly affirming to see yourself in it and to see yourself, represented in ways that aren't normally represented. Constructing the West through its global interventions, uprisings, that was adjacent to, revolutions. Craft and witchcraft, which I thought was a kind of fun collaboration or a fun thing to put together. So this notion that, witchcraft and magic is a craft. So what if we put that in with origami and, and paper mache as well? So you'd sift through it and all of a sudden see books on, knitting and then casting hexes and spells. I refused to have a women's studies section or a feminist section. Instead, we turned it into men's studies because my idea was that, women's work, once you start segregating out some of these sections, what you're actually saying is that it's a specialty area and that it's not part of, normal conversation or normal reality. But by segmenting and creating a men's studies, we're actually focusing on patriarchy and we're focusing on, the power that's usually, accumulated by men. And it's a hilarious section actually, because there's, all these great kind of like pop psychology books, plus, how to dress like a power man. It's pretty hilarious. Here we go. Yeah. How a Man Ages, Taoist Secrets of Love, man watching, male grooming, men's travel guide, men's studies. Sewing for Men and Boys. That's also a good one. That's on the side there. And then this was, I think, the Radical Desires section. So the Happy Hooker, Women Without Children, the Scarlet Letter. And another fun thing that we did for it was create these pairs of books that you were forced to buy because they were literally shrink wrapped together. So, also thinking about how you can't have one without the other. So if you bought Victorian Gardens, you'd also be forced to buy Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism because, these things are really, they're related and you can't necessarily segregate, one topic from the other. This is another a pair that was put together. So Before the Mayflower and, the Life of Christopher Columbus. Bill Gates's The Road Ahead with Jared Diamond's Collapse. So they're tongue-in-cheek and they're funny, and they're meant to also raise the value of these books because we were also getting these books, we were able to pull thousands of books from the used book donation station at the San Francisco Public Library. And many of these books are deemed worthless. And by that, it means that there's just so many copies of them floating around that there's kind of no market for them. So these would be considered dollar books. And by packaging them up together and shrink wrapping them, we were able to sell these pairs for $10. And thus raising more funds for the library with just a kind of like conceptual twist. And then this is a Blackboard that kind of had our a kind of collection of all the areas, because as 5 days progressed, we also had our different sections kind of rise and fall depending on how many books we had in there. So we were constantly shifting and constantly changing and inventing new categories and sections. In the end, I'm really happy to say that we raised it was a 3-day project. In 3 days, we raised over $20,000 in really cheap, affordable book sales, all to benefit the San Francisco Public Library's education program. So the other thing I like to share too is that a lot of these projects do have this kind of other form of economies that I put into them. The portrait that I made, the total transparency portrait that I worked on with the undocumented former student of mine, every time I sell that work, all my proceeds and profits for it go directly to fund her documentary film that she's making on undocumented young people. So I'm also very cautious about, as an artist, like how I quote unquote profit off of some of these things. And I try to, as best as possible, if it makes sense, to create sort of equitable outcomes for them and not just, I guess, like discuss them as metaphors. So I should sort of hurry up a little bit. I'm gonna switch to a kind of related, my latest works are dealing with were triggered actually by stumbling across this one stereo card in in an antique store in Asheville, North Carolina. So I was in Asheville working on a project and wandered into an antique store and was looking through some of their old photos and came across this, what I thought was a really beautiful depiction of Filipino weavers, working on their craft. It was from 1904. And I was really proud to kind of find something like this and bought it for $2. And then as I looked closely at it, though, I started to realize there was something kind of off about this. So there was a sign, obviously, at the top left that says native cloth. There's also a reference at the, in the tagline that says Bagobos women in the Philippine village, like as this, this kind of generic space of a village. And doing a little bit more research on it, well, this is how it's actually supposed to be viewed too. So, these stereo cards were an early form of 3D technology. They were also tourist objects that were highly collected and purchased by the public. What they were, though, it was from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And so in 1904, the Philippines was a colony. It was officially a colony of the United States, having been won from Spain prior, just as Puerto Rico and Cuba had been. And so when this photograph was taken and circulated, it wasn't in the Philippines. It was actually in St. Louis because they'd imported 1,200 native Filipinos into St. Louis and constructed a kind of fake Filipino village for them to be displayed in, and essentially to show the public, their new colony. So just as some background, the St. Louis World's Fair was this incredibly opulent situation. Like huge buildings were built and they were massively entertaining, plus seen as a kind of educational look at American power. Millions of people would come to this, and you were expected to spend like up to a week or two viewing all the different pavilions. This is a diagram of the Filipino village itself, which actually was quite large. So it had multiple buildings, multiple pavilions, and also multiple tribes represented. Very complicated. This is a photograph, showing of like a quote unquote tribe. And the other thing that was fascinating about this is that, we can think now and say, wow, that's like a really like a barbaric way, to show people we don't do this anymore. We've kind of, we've moved forward. But thinking too about how ethnographic photography was developed hand in hand with actually the technology of photography. You know, it was looking at images like this that actually created and constructed the American identity, because we could look at photographs like this and say, we are not like this. We are civilized. We are different. These are others. And so, you know, these types of images, they still circulate, which I think is really fascinating, right? So what we learned from ethnographic photography isn't just that these were things that happened in the past, but they are still in the present, in the ways that we look at them and that we do value them for different reasons. What's also really fascinating are that these images, even though they circulate for free in the public domain, also wind up being used or sold through stock photography. So, you know, this is something which I think is endlessly fascinating, that even if we think of, you know, these, the initial group of Filipinos as, say, having been, you know, victimized through, you know, their participation as, you know, as tribal others in 1904, their images are still being rendered as a kind of capitalist, you know, accumulation in some way. And I just think that's really fascinating, right? Like we can, especially if you're interested in like media studies or photo history, you know, that depictions of people aren't neutral in many ways. And this constant kind of flow of these people as being in this position is still highly valued, right? I mean, literally, it's highly valued. And I've also been reading a lot of this theorist Ariela Azoulay, who's been writing a lot about how photography, and especially ethnographic photography, and by extension, museums and archives, all still have a very strong hand in perpetuating, you know, images that are almost hard to escape, especially if you come from the groups who are being depicted today. And so part of my ideas and inspiration in going further into this was I also had an exhibition that was being planned in St. Louis concurrently, which was kind of great, a really interesting intersection. So I found the stereo card. I was planning an exhibition at the Contemporary Museum in St. Louis, and then realized that I needed to start doing research into the history in St. Louis. So I spent 2 weeks going through different archives at the Missouri Historical Society, the St. Louis Public Library, and also the St. Louis Mercantile Library, and setting up a tripod and camera to photograph on site some of the materials I was finding in relationship to Filipinos and the World's Fair. And what I wanted to do, though, was not represent the photos, or at least not represent them in the ways that are typically seen. Because, you know, the point of having these photographs like fully legible or fully shown to the public doesn't change how one positions oneself in relationship to them. So what I wound up doing was a very physical kind of intervention where every image was rephotographed with myself either blocking or denying the ability of the viewer to look at it, or you could even say maybe like caring for or protecting those who would otherwise be consumed by the viewer. And what's left, though, so instead of just say like throwing away or deleting the image, what's left is the surrounding. What's left is all the ways, the apparatus, just like the photo studio apparatus that I was showing, you know, the green screen, the photo lights, everything, that's still left there to implicate the total construction of these people's realities at the time. And how that was shown was through a collection of about 30 images in a vitrine that created a kind of, overlapping. And you walked around a vitrine and there was no one particular position to look at it. So you also had to shift your body around this display in order to look at everything properly, thus also implicating you as the viewer to not being able to, you know, passively consume the images. This went along with a larger installation that also was built in relationship to the St. Louis World's Fair research I was doing. So over the past couple of years, I've been building these, what I would call these platform installations. And to me, they remind me of sort of repurposed museum displays. So, you know, there's a kind of like, you know, pedestal or a display area or a stage set, if that's what you want to call it. And on top of it are images and objects, many of them sourced from the internet. So I do rampant research of historical and contemporary images, and I mix them in with real objects, fabricated objects, artificial and real plants, digitally produced textiles, and to create this kind of like total collapse of images and textures and references. And so what you're looking at here is both historical references to the 1904 World's Fair, but also contemporary images of how race and society are constructed even today. So the Chroma Key green comes up. There's even Chroma Key green tiki torches. And there's photo color calibration charts. So, color calibration charts are very popular with trying to get a correct photo. There's also cosmetic charts, which show different shades of like foundation and colors. Here's what is it? Some, green, Chroma Key green caps that, could even be interpreted as, mega hats, as well as with the Chroma Key green tiki torches, which we all, are now familiar with as both being a kind of Orientalist, object, a kind of Hawaiian-like object, but now also a white supremacist, protest gear. So these mix-ups, and if you start looking too, you see everything from like fruit to like ethnic textiles to emojis. They start to kind of all collapse together because, if we're living in an incredibly visual time right now where everything almost exists at once, like we're both reliving history, re-narrating it, and also adding new images on top of that. And the whole thing is both confusing, but it's also incredibly dense. And and there's stock photos also of like tropical fruit. If you're standing in front of this, you can kind of peek through lots of different layers. There's laser cut wooden plants that are painted Chroma Key green. There's also spray painted Chroma Key green plants. There's objects. Oh, there's lots of pictures of people looking at themselves in mirrors, like a kind of doubling. Thinking about how they're being represented or looking back at the viewer. There's little references. This is kind of insider stuff too. And I don't expect everyone to get all this, but this is a reference to Alfred Kroeber, a famous anthropologist who studied and also housed Ishi, one of the quote unquote last Yahi indigenous California folks. And then there are also artifacts that I was downloading from the Metropolitan Museum's collection of Filipino artifacts, many of them knives and statues. I print them all at 100% of the size of the actual object, and then I mount them onto laser cut wood. And so what you're looking at, many of these things are actually not objects, but they're flat fronted, props, I guess. And then it's also mixed in with masks. Like lots of masks that were downloaded from Amazon.com. And the more you start looking at it, you can start to kind of see these references pop up too of resistance. So, forces that are kind of fighting some of the narratives that keep coming into play, whether that's through the rocks and the bricks or the emoji fists, or the poops were set up in areas that I kind of wanted to call out as really problematic. And then, color calibration charts. So again, these are really rich. Oops, I'm gonna just talk about this or wrap this up. So, these are really rich references. And for me, again, they remind me a lot, actually, working on projects like this remind me a lot of how my desktop is. So like I'm constantly downloading photographs. I've also got too many windows open. And so sometimes like a historical document is completely, right next to say like a news snippet happening today. And that's kind of like how I feel like we're processing, our realities. It's through this like mashup of things that are both really jarring, but also make total sense if you create the bridges for how we got to where we are today. Oops. And so I'm going to kind of, I'm going to shift gears into another area, and I'll wrap it up. I think I got another 5 or 10 minutes, but so I really dislike showing ethnographic images straight up. The only reason I'm showing this one is because I think there's a corollary one, which I think gives the flip side to it. So this was a child named Singhua, who was a child that was displayed and also heavily photographed during the 1904 World's Fair. And so this is interesting because it also has the calibration chart, photographed right next to it. This is a studio portrait taken with the child to kind of pose in this way. Another interesting pose that the child was made to kind of take or do, positioned the child on the other side of the camera. And so granted, this is also a setup. Like I really doubt this child was, taking photographs or was a photographer. But it's like what happens? Like what are the possibilities that happen when the subject becomes the looker or the maker of the images? Like what new narratives can we come up with? And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've spent the last year as a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow in Washington, D.C. at the National Museum of American History. And so I applied for this fellowship with the express notion of looking for, I wanted to find evidence of the Philippines and Filipinos in the photographic collection of the National Museum of American History. It's a very straightforward kind of, a research project. And I wanted to see what was in there because I wanted to see how America viewed its colonies. Not because I really had any strong interest in like finding my identity, because that's not what this work is about, actually. This work is about how archives can or cannot be receptacles for actual experiences and actual lived histories of everybody. And so as I was searching through the archives, what became increasingly clear is that there was incredibly little in the National American Museum, and then thus the National American psyche of the presence of a former colony, the Philippines, in it. What I was finding though were these really interesting sort of like margins and subheads in that search. So one of the really, interesting things that popped up was actually this image, which is not of Filipino natives at all, but it's of an anthropologist who went to the Philippines and in the late 1800s played native, like took photos of himself dressed as a native. And so this is an image that rests in there under the search for Philippines or Filipino. So again, this really interesting notion of a constructed image standing in for the real thing. There's also when I was looking for things, I also became really interested in damaged images. Because again, if you can't find yourself in a collection or in an archive, it doesn't mean you weren't there. It just means that the historical memory is imperfect. And so I started focusing on damaged images as a kind of metaphor for the kind of the damage to the real American story. And so whether that was this disintegrating glass negative, which is not something I made, like this is a found object and a found image in the database, it starts to really I think express for me the sort of holes that I was finding. What was also great is there's a lot of cases in the database or the search engines where they don't have the original anymore, or the copy of the image is now the stand-in for the image. So this is what I found on the database. It's a dead Filipino guerrilla who was killed fighting the Americans, actually. You can't see a better image than this because they've lost the original reference to it. So it's this kind of like degraded and unclear, which to me, again, is like a really interesting metaphor. So I'm going to just go through some of these other finds that I found. Emulsion damage on a negative. I went to the Lunder Conservation Center at the National Portrait Gallery and talked to them too about what it meant to fix damaged artworks. And so this is this is just a quick digital print of a George Catlett painting of native folks before it was fully restored. So, now the painting itself looks perfect. They've removed all the damage onto the original as a way to kind of show the beauty of the original art object. But by erasing that damage, it also erases a potential narrative of, some of the more maybe actual, historical narrative. There's also this great collection in the Lunder Center of like failed materials. Again, I'm looking for things in the archive that are not good. You know, they're not right. They've been damaged in some way. So this is a slide from the Better America series, completely illegible and yet still completely beautiful. Also really weird things. So I would have to look at strange kind of referencing, strange titles. So if Philippines didn't exist, I would have to type in like Oriental and just see what came up, you know. And so here's you can see, you know, here's periodicals, periods, politics, paint, Oriental. I was like, oh, you know, what's in there? And this is all through database searches. You have to find something and then you have to call the box, and then it takes sometimes a day or two for the box to come, and then you have to look into it and see what's actually in there. And what's great is, so in this file folder of Oriental, it's literally just these two, I don't know what they are, they're like stickers or something, and they're just like hanging out in this folder. A kind of, for me, like funny surprise. Like, I don't know what, you know, what this is or why this makes any sense at all to being in there. There's no kind of relationship to it. And then also just some really, you know, just what do you do also with the really problematic things? Like, here's another collection. I don't even know if you can read this, because, so there's a file that's labeled Ku Klux Klan in bubbly letters. That must have been an intern writing this. I don't even, it's almost illegible. And so, you know, when you go into that, like, what do you do then with those things? Like, how can you process American history and talk about it and share it without reifying or kind of like reinvigorating some of their subjects? So what I was doing with some of these things that I was finding was photographing them with their contents turned over. So after going through everything in the file and looking at it, I kept that stacked in reverse and photographed their behinds. And so you're not able to actually see what the messaging was, what the recruitment pamphlets were, you know, what some of the kind of, you know, the more, I guess, like, you know, damaging kind of historical things, but they're still there. And what's fascinating about that too is it's hard to even tell like why some of these things were collected. Like, there's news clippings that appear to not have anything to do with it, but you can maybe infer that it did. On the backs of the news clippings too, well, actually, I'll move forward. So I'll come back to that one because it pops up again. And then as I'm sifting through the images, I'm also re-photographing things on site, like in the actual archives, in ways to then, you know, reprocess the images. So, you know, whether that's like finding people, you know, looking or arranging them. Also, I just love all this damage. So these are lots of little bits of old paper. You'd open up a lot of folders and it was like, oh, look, there's all the history. The history just kind of disintegrated in front, you know, and the history would fall onto the ground and then it would get vacuumed up later. And, you know, all these things that sort of symbolize like our, you know, our shared, you know, society. And so I very quickly, what I'm now trying to do is process thousands of photographs that I've taken over the period of almost a month and a half, going in and out of the archive. And thankfully, I wrapped up my time in Washington, DC in February, and then immediately afterwards had started a residency at a couple places, or I had multiple residencies to try to process the images, but that got cut short because of COVID. So I'm now revisiting it in my studio, which you can kind of see around me are, you know, large prints on the ground. But I started reprinting these images on a cheap LaserJet printer and then taping them together to form larger posters or pictures of them. And there's something interesting too about using an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper to blow up and talk about documents and file folders and things that are also on, you know, kind of held in standard office products. Because this reconstruction, for me at least, of these documents in American history is a very tactile quality. So even though for me, when the reason I was working like this by taping together these cheap inkjet prints was because I didn't have access at the time to a large format printer. But now I kind of think that, you know, this is actually a really interesting tactic moving forward. So, and, you know, again, this is a detail of the KKK documents. You know, what's really fascinating too is that, so the backs of these newspaper clippings have the most sort of like beautiful and mundane, you know, notifications of what was happening during the time also. So whether that was that the Poetry Society was meeting, or, you know, the cathedral was hosting a bake sale, or, you know, a cookie recipe. these things are all happening at the same time and really are, you know, the kind of like hidden, they're the flip side to this kind of underbelly and anxiety and, you know, and really like problematic parts of America. They go hand in hand. And so this is a shot of not my current studio, but the studio I had at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans the day before COVID hit, and I had to quickly pack my bags and leave the start of a 2-month residency. So I'd been there for only 5 days, and unfortunately had to leave. But I'm going to end, I think, with this image, just because, again, I'm trying to process, you know, where to go from here. The images you see on the wall are actually the reverse of photographs from an album I found of a Japanese family that had been interned during World War II. And these photographs, it appears, had been like ripped out of or removed from a scrapbook. And so what you're looking at is the kind of residue and the glue and the black paper of the scrapbook that had adhered to them. And again, you know, trying not to show bodies in ways that I think perpetuate a kind of restricted narrative of how people have been depicted, but, you know, create the kind of, the way of telling a story that shows their removal and shows, you know, some of the problems that are still inherent in, you know, how as Americans, we discuss our place, you know, in this country. So with that, I think I'm gonna end. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks so much for sharing your work. I think that I should also just mention that for those of you who weren't here right at the beginning, Professor of Art History Baron Galanu is here as well, and I believe her class even joins us. And so I know that that this work will probably generate a lot of discussion and questions, and we welcome that. And we ask that tonight, if you want to, we get started, and if you want to join in and write in the chat here, and I'll do my best to re-articulate those questions as we go. So we can start that process now. Yes, to the person who just asked that question, if they can ask a question.
Well, first of all, it's so nice to see all the Filipino or Filipino Americans in the chat who are sharing. Yeah, I appreciate it. Okay, should I just grab the one that just came out? Okay, so I'll just start. So Cindy asks, is your art primarily focused on visualizing history or events? And I wonder if other people have ever misunderstood your works of art different from what you mean, because sometimes artworks of true based or historical could be misinterpreted by individuals. That's an interesting question. So I guess in a way, right, like maybe, you know, I would say, yeah, in the last 4 years, I've been looking at history, specifically because, again, this, you know, I want to turn the lens on America, and I want to turn the lens also on my place in America, as well as also the way America places everyone else. So, you know, because of that, so I would say maybe that's a more recent situation, but have people misunderstood my works of art? I think sometimes what I've found, and this is really interesting, right? So if I do something about, say, with Filipinos in it, or about, you know, say the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, there's this notion that, oh, she's trying to investigate her identity as a Filipino. And I would really like to counter that, because that's not what I'm doing at all. I'm actually using, I'm more interested in how America has constructed the identity of the Filipino. And by America, I usually mean the non-Filipino America, you know, like the America that sort of had the camera, the language, the words, and the history books to write what happened. And so that's not for me a discovery of any true identity. And so that's what sometimes I fight against. And so when I'm, especially with the new work now, which was, you know, literally started with looking or trying to find images of the Philippines in an American history museum. and not finding anything. I've had to really branch out, and I actually really appreciate that. So a lot of the images I'm showing aren't necessarily about the Philippines per se, but it's about the holes and margins in the archive. And many of us can actually, find ourselves in those places in there. But it's interesting that I think if you're an artist of color in the US, anything you do that happens to maybe look like an artist of color thing, all of a sudden that's all you can do, or that's all it's about. Whereas, it's really hard to fight that actually, because, again, it's not that I'm not proud of my heritage. I start from being a Filipino American, but that's not really where I think my, the work rests. And so, Cindy, I know that's not necessarily where your question came from. And also, I'm not sure really what you mean about true-based or historical being misinterpreted, but I think, yeah, maybe we can pursue that in a follow-up question. Oh, okay. So Zach asks, so use the Chroma Key green as an analogy for the history of the US to fabricate lies and display only what the government wants us to see. Also, how long did it take for you to sew your checkerboard backdrop? Thank you. Yeah, I guess in a nutshell, I mean, honestly, the Chroma Key, yeah, I mean, I've been using the Chroma Key because I think systems of power, so that just happens to be, say, the government system or whoever wields the power at the moment, whether that's also white supremacists or, what have you. So it's not just the government. But the thing about Chroma Key green too is that any image can be put onto it. So it has the possibility and potential for a total rewriting. Right? Like maybe initially I started using it, especially with the dresses. I actually talked about it at first, when I was first making them, my direct analogy was, I also wanted to talk about how white supremacy is invisible, right? If it's in everything, if it's in every sort of like, also that kind of symbol, or it was a metaphor for how like, you're not supposed to see it. It's all this other stuff goes into it, but it's always there. I've sort of started to kind of like think now more about the possibilities of Chroma Key instead of its like limitation or its only being a power, kind of metaphor. And then regarding how long, so the checkered backdrop actually took, I would work on and off on it. I had to figure out. So imagine, do you see? No, you don't see it. I have a sewing machine back there. And so on that one sewing machine, I had to figure out how to sew a 26-foot wide panel. And essentially it was like making it like rolling up portions of it and making it all in like manageable, like 4-foot panels. And then at the end, sewing all those panels together. I hired 2 former student assistants to help me. And so I would say it took us, I don't know, like maybe a month or so, but yeah. And then let's see, anyone else?
I have a question about the Chroma Key dresses then that you have.
Yeah.
Since you can project whatever that you want to on it, given like the nature of Chroma Key, would you like re-show these works like displaying like whatever message it is that you are trying to like to change the narrative or to emphasize the narrative that you're trying to bring out, like with this history of like these outfits?
Yeah,
And
that's
like make it a digital?
Yeah, no, that's a good question because I get asked that also, like, well, they work, I mean, like they technically work, like you can, digitally, put anything on that. But I've actually decided to not do that because I want the viewer to almost like construct what they're projecting onto it, right? So like once I start doing that, then I start actually like tailoring a message of like, it must be this or it must be that. And if anything, I'm interested in how, like right now we have this like ridiculous situation where, there's this notion that both sides are valid, right? So, so authoritarianism and fascism is like a valid, position. And then on another side, it's like extreme, like, I don't know, like, it's communism and socialism, and those 2 poles are always, they're put on the same thing sometimes, which is ridiculous and really strange. So I feel like, anyway, I appreciate the question because it's possible, but I want to leave the green itself to be the signifier and let that stand.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, collaboration with former students. Okay, so yeah, what is it? So I teach classes in social practice, sometimes at UC Berkeley. And what that looks like is, usually we have a kind of theme that we're working on. And then I really try to involve the students in a way that we kind of blur either authorship or what we're doing. And that's also so that I'm not necessarily creating a kind of authority, complex on it. And so that works within the classroom sometimes. And it's been really interesting. Like for one class, we were 5 weeks into the class. The projects didn't seem to be going well. Nobody was really interested. Everyone was complaining about school and how like the art department sucked or something. And so I just said, all right, well, let's make our own art school. And they were like, what? And it was like, yeah, no, let's do it. So let's create a radical alternative to, we have 9 weeks left. What do you want to do? And so we created Art School X, which was like this, attempt to then reconsider like what art school teaching is, what learning is, what could be taught in a more radical environment. And the great thing, what happened in the end though, is we kind of failed, which was really great because it sort of showed how difficult it was. And it brought the students through a kind of reckoning of how to work in and out of institutions. And anyway, it was really interesting and really lovely. So the motivations are, people obviously have to be motivated to participate in something. When I collaborated with the undergrads who helped me with the citizens' portraits, we were really all trying to process what just happened. I mean, like they were these intense visual protests on our campus. So they came to us. We didn't have to travel very far from them. And then we really had to, maybe it was a form of kind of collective reckoning, like where making the images helped us sort of like talk through and work through, what we saw. And so I hope that answered it a little bit. Okay, so from Ethan, could you further elaborate on your choice to go against the idea of cultural showcase within one's work and the choice to focus your attention on something else instead? Oh, okay. I'll try to answer that one. You could put in a follow-up if I didn't quite direct it that way. But okay, so again, I'm just going to put this in context. So I started art school in the early 90s, so I went to school in 1991 to 1995. Which is known now in retrospect as looking at this time of like heavy identity politics. That term has kind of come back again, which I find is really fascinating because back when it originated in the early 90s, it was seen almost as a kind of like, a denigration, like a way to, oh, those artists just deal with identity politics. So after looking at all that and being in art school, I realized, or it was really drummed into me to not do that kind of work, because to do that meant that you were put into a class of artists that wasn't speaking for everybody, or it was, kind of like only about, identity. And the problem with that notion though, right, is that segments people into believing or thinking that, culturally specific work only applies to people of that particular culture. And unfortunately, I internalized a lot of that in my early years. And so, wound up making a lot of work where I didn't address at all the notion of being Asian American or Filipino American, whatever. Like I actually, kind of purposely sort of like didn't want to do that work because I knew that the art world and society was going to pigeonhole me into only being able to make work about that. Since then, though, I feel like I've matured in my thinking and realized that it's completely possible to talk about one's personal background and one's personal stance, but also be incredibly strong in kind of putting the message out there that it's actually about lots of other things, right? It's like, and you could say that too about maybe early on in, say, early feminist artwork where, women who made a certain type of work were put into a kind of box. And so other women, sort of like ran away from that. Like, I'm not going to make work, about feminism because that's really uncool. What's interesting now, I think, though, is that I wonder, there's been a huge shift again, like, work about personal history and political position is kind of back in the spotlight. But in the 1990s, that changed really quickly. Like it went out of fashion so fast. And what I hope now is that it doesn't, quote unquote, go out of fashion, that what happens is a kind of broader understanding of what work about either difference or community or individual position, that it can become a kind of stand-in for a societal way of looking at things and not just segmented. So that's again, I might have gone on to a tangent about that, but I'm really cautious about, you know, what's going to happen in 5 years in terms of like what art will still be celebrated or what might not be cool anymore, if that makes sense. Let's see. Okay, so how about we'll finish up with the last question, which is, I'll just summarize it. Is it possible for artists to work critically on this new and hopeful political situation after having overcome the greater demon? And actually, I'll just read it out loud, the first part. From my point of view, we have just saved ourselves from a fascist threat, Trump's re-election, and we are going to return to the pre-Trump reality, which is neoliberal politics, with all the injustices and oppressions that this entails. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so that's the other thing we're up against, right? And thank you for bringing up that question. Even though I identified only the last 4 years, you know, of being in, of showing you the projects I did in the last 4 years, and that all pivoted around the election and me understanding, you know, like I wanted to turn inwards rather than work on projects about globalization. Another, you know, sort of like realization, right, is that just because there's a shift in power right now doesn't mean that all those things that were put into place prior for centuries and centuries, that has not changed. And so that's been my biggest lesson and takeaway in the reexamination of American history, whether that's looking through our archives that have been accumulating for, you know, centuries, to, you know, even like the 1904 World's Fair, to all the earlier things, you know, that we keep perpetuating. So yeah, we are not going back to some like fabulous time where everyone can feel safe. Like a lot of the things that Trump weaponized were actually, you know, structures that were in place prior to him. So these are not, there's still so much work to do. And I really do hope that people don't take too much of a, even though we should be glad, you know, that there's been a shift, there's so much work to do. And it's just become so much more apparent. So Unai, thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's a really, really great topic to, theme to kind of end on. Mm-hmm. So thank you.
So thank you all for your questions and participating in this process, and for being here tonight. And of course, Stephanie Syjuco, we really appreciate your sharing generously your projects and your ideas with us. We're glad to have had you join us here at UB.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. I'm so glad to see your faces. I think I might have to insist that my students all turn their cameras on, because I have a policy that you don't have to, just because you never know where someone is, and I don't want people to feel vulnerable if they're not, you know, ready to share. But I really appreciate it. So thanks for having your cameras on, folks. It's nice to see you. So I guess like, and Baron, thank you so much. And Max, thank you as well.
That was really inspiring. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
All right.
Okay, thank you all. Good night.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.